Title: The Waters of Weinwick. Chapter 1: Shadows Beneath the Surface. The story begins with Conrad returning to the small, overcast town of Weinwick. It had been a year since he'd last seen Jed, his closest friend from their shared days at college. They had kept in touch through letters, a habit both enjoyed, finding comfort in the tangible presence of each other's words. But Jed's most recent letters had shifted in tone, growing progressively darker, filled with disjointed sentences and erratic scrawls. And then, the letters had simply stopped. As Conrad approaches the Weinwick Recreation Centre, he feels an unshakable weight pressing down on him. There is something oppressive about the air, as though it carries an unnatural heaviness, a murmur that grows louder the closer he gets to the centre's abandoned pool house. He pauses outside, looking up at the structure that had once been bustling with life. Now, it stood hollow and silent, the windows darkened, as though hiding a sinister secret within. Conrad enters the recreation centre and finds that his footsteps echo eerily in the empty hallway. The centre had been closed for renovations after a series of mysterious incidents had taken place around the pool. A boy had drowned under unknown circumstances, and soon after, Jed had taken a position as the night shift security guard. But the weight of the tragedies still clung to the place like an invisible stain. The final letter. Conrad recalls the last letter he received from Jed. Its tone had been frantic, almost hysterical. Conrad, I can't explain it. Not fully. Not in a way that makes sense. It's in the pool, in the water. I've heard the splashes when no one's around. Seen shadows beneath the surface that don't belong there. Sometimes I feel it watching me. And I swear it's aware, like it knows I'm looking back. I don't think I'm alone in here, Con. Something happened in that water, something wrong. The things I see at night, they're not right. I can't leave, though. It's as if it's holding on to me, keeping me here. I'll try to write more soon, but if you don't hear from me, just know that I was right, Jed. But the words had haunted Conrad, disturbing his sleep as his mind lingered on Jed's suffering. Reading between the lines, Conrad had sensed that his friend was afraid, truly terrified in a way he'd never seen before. He could hardly reconcile the person writing those words with the confident, lively Jed he had once known. Inside the pool house, Conrad finally makes his way to the pool house, his nerves tensing as he steps inside. The doors creak open with a loud, reluctant groan, and he is immediately engulfed by the smell of damp air and the faint, lingering scent of chlorine. The room is dimly lit, but his eyes quickly adjust to the gloom. His footsteps echo through the empty space as he moves closer to the pool. The pool itself is massive, stretching across most of the room, its water still and dark as ink. The lights overhead cast weak, sickly reflections on its surface, creating the illusion of depths far greater than they truly were. As Conrad approaches, he feels a strange chill creeping over him, raising the hair on the back of his neck. He stops at the edge of the pool, gazing into its depths, the water so dark that it feels like staring into an abyss. A strange sensation washes over him, a feeling of weight, as though the pool were a living, breathing thing, silently watching him, waiting. The silence is overwhelming, thick and unnatural. And then, barely a whisper, he hears it. A faint, childlike laugh echoing from somewhere in the room. He whips around, scanning the empty space, but finds nothing. Only the faintest ripples disturb the pool's surface, as though something beneath had stirred. A glimpse of shadows. Determined to dismiss the unsettling sensation, Conrad continues to explore. He notices signs of disuse everywhere. Peeling paint, cobwebs clinging to the walls, and empty lifeguard stands covered in a fine layer of dust. Yet there's something else. An eerie presence. A sensation as though he's being watched by unseen eyes lurking just beyond the edges of his vision. Conrad turns his flashlight on, the beam cutting through the shadows, illuminating the corners of the pool house. But in the split second before he moves the light, he catches a glimpse of something. A dark shape moving beneath the water's surface, shifting like a shadow. He freezes, his heart pounding. But when he directs the flashlight back to the spot, there's nothing there. Just the still black water staring back at him. "Jed," he murmurs, a strange, heavy sadness filling him as he remembers the desperation in his friend's last letter. "What did you see in here?" A sense of dread gnaws at him, but he refuses to leave. He takes a deep breath and slowly paces around the pool, his gaze fixed on the water, as if hoping to see something, anything that might explain Jed's terror. The murmurs begin. Just as he's about to turn away, he hears a faint murmur rising from the depths of the pool. It sounds like a voice, muffled and distorted, as though traveling through water. He strains to hear, stepping closer, leaning forward, his mind grappling with the impossible sensation that something, is trying to communicate with him. The voice grows clearer, though still just beyond understanding, like a dream that slips away upon waking. It is filled with anguish, a pleading tone that tugs at his heart. And then, amid the unintelligible words, he hears a distinct whisper, "Help! Trapped!" The words send a chill down his spine. His flashlight slips from his hand, clattering onto the tiles as the voice fades, leaving him alone once more in the oppressive silence of the pool house. But the weight of the water. Breathing heavily, Conrad steps back, the weight of fear and confusion pressing down on him. He tries to steady himself, gathering the courage to continue, but his instincts scream at him to leave, to abandon this place that reeks of death and despair. But before he can move, he feels something, a shift in the air, a presence coiling around him like an unseen mist. It's subtle at first, a whisper of movement behind him, the faintest splash from the pool. He turns, his pulse quickening as he gazes into the water once more. And there, just beneath the surface, is a face. The face is pale, distorted, staring up at him with wide, unseeing eyes. It's the face of a child, lips parted as if gasping for air, frozen in an expression of terror. Conrad stumbles back, nearly losing his balance, his mind reeling. The image fades, the water's surface returning to an impenetrable black. He's shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he tries to process what he's seen. But before he can fully comprehend, he feels a sudden weight on his chest, a suffocating pressure that steals the air from his lungs. He clutches at his chest, gasping, as though he's being pulled down, submerged in the cold depths of the pool despite standing on solid ground. As he struggles, he hears a voice, soft and clear, echoing in his mind. Come down to us." The words fill him with an overwhelming dread, each syllable pressing down on him, pulling him closer to the edge. His mind fills with images of dark, endless water, of shadows drifting beneath the surface, of hands reaching up to drag him down. He tries to resist, to pull himself back, but the force is too strong, relentless in its grip. A moment of escape. Just when he thinks he's about to lose himself entirely, the pressure vanishes. Conrad stumbles back, falling to his knees, gasping for breath. The pool house is silent once more, the oppressive weight lifting slightly, though the sense of a presence lingers, watching him with a patient, calculating malice. He stands slowly, his mind a blur of fear and confusion. The rational part of him screams to leave, to escape this cursed place and never return. But another part, the part that brought him here in the first place, urges him to stay, to uncover the truth that has claimed his friend. Conrad picks up his flashlight, his grip tight as he directs the beam once more over the pool. The water stares back, dark and unyielding, offering no answers, only the promise of secrets hidden beneath its surface. "I'll find you, Jed," he whispers, his voice trembling but resolute. "I'll find out what happened to you. I won't leave you here alone." With one last look at the pool, he turns and exits the pool house, the heavy silence following him out into the night. The faint sound of laughter echoes behind him, growing softer, as if sinking back into the depths, leaving him haunted by the images and voices that have etched themselves into his memory. And as he steps into the cold night air, Conrad knows he cannot turn back. Whatever darkness lies within the pool house, it has taken Jed, and now it is reaching for him as well. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Dark. Conrad couldn't shake the images from his mind. Jed's last letter, the dark water, the twisted face that had stared up at him from the pool. He lay awake that night, haunted by the suffocating silence of the pool house, the whispers that seemed to pull him toward the water. It was nearly dawn by the time he drifted into a restless sleep, his dreams filled with murky shapes, shadowed faces, and faint cries echoing through the darkness. When he awoke, the sense of dread still clung to him, an oppressive weight pressing down on his chest. He knew he couldn't confront this mystery alone, and there was someone in town who might have the answers he needed. A visit to the janitor. The former janitor of the Weinwick Recreation Centre, a reclusive man named Eli, was rumoured to have experienced his own unsettling encounters before quitting his job abruptly and retreating to his small house on the outskirts of town. People whispered that Eli had seen something so terrifying it drove him away from the centre and into a solitary life. Conrad felt he had no choice but to speak to him. The sky was overcast, casting a grey pallor over Weinwick as Conrad made his way to Eli's home. The neighbourhood was silent, as though the town itself was holding its breath. When he reached Eli's door, he hesitated, taking a moment to gather himself before he knocked. The door opened slightly, and Eli's tired eyes appeared in the crack, looking wary and shadowed. "Who are you?" Eli asked, his voice a dry whisper. "My name is Conrad. I'm here about the pool house. I think you know my friend, Jed." At the mention of Jed, Eli's face darkened, his expression wary but resigned. After a pause, he opened the door wider and motioned for Conrad to enter. The inside of the house was dimly lit and cluttered, with books and papers stacked in haphazard piles. There was a faint smell of mildew, mixed with something else, a hint of salt, like the air around the pool. "Sit down," Eli said, gesturing toward a worn armchair. "But I'm warning you, if you came looking for answers, you might not like what you hear." Eli's account. Eli settled into his own chair, rubbing his hands together as if to ward off a chill. He stared at Conrad for a long moment before he began to speak. "It started years ago," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was working the late shift, just like Jed. At first, it was little things, strange noises, whispers. I'd hear footsteps echoing in the empty halls, the sound of splashing from the pool when no one was there. I tried to ignore it, thought I was just imagining things, but it got worse, much worse." Eli's hands trembled as he spoke, his gaze distant, as though he were seeing the pool house in his mind's eye. "One night, I heard a child's laughter coming from the pool," he continued. "I knew the place was empty, but the sound was so clear, so real. I went to check it out, and I saw him. A little boy, standing at the edge of the pool, looking into the water. His reflection was all wrong. It was like it wasn't really him, like something else was looking back at me." Conrad listened, his heart pounding as Eli described the apparition. He felt a chill settle over him, a terrible certainty that whatever haunted the pool house was far more malevolent than he had imagined. "I quit after that night," Eli said, his voice shaking. "I couldn't take it anymore, but sometimes I still hear him, in my dreams. And when I do, it's like he's calling to me, asking for help." The drowned boy's family. Conrad thanked Eli for sharing his story, though it left him more unsettled than ever. He wondered if there was any connection between Eli's experience and Jed's disappearance. As he walked back through town, he recalled what Eli had said about the boy at the pool, and an idea struck him. The boy's family. He had to speak with them. The family had moved to another part of town after the drowning, away from the memories of loss that haunted them. Conrad found their small, modest house, nestled between rows of old trees. The boy's mother, Mrs. Baines, answered the door, her eyes tired and hollow. She seemed unsurprised to see him, as though she had been expecting someone like him to show up eventually. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Mrs. Baines," Conrad began. "My name is Conrad, and I was a friend of Jed. I know about what happened to your son, and I was hoping you could help me understand." Mrs. Baines studied him for a long moment, her gaze sharp and filled with a sadness that seemed to cut through him. She led him into the living room, where she sat in silence, as though gathering the strength to speak. "Leo loved swimming," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "He used to spend hours at the pool. But a few weeks before he died, he started telling me strange things. He said he saw someone in the water. A boy, just like him, but wrong somehow. He said the boy would stand at the bottom of the pool and watch him. Conrad felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Mrs. Baines went on, her voice wavering. I thought he was imagining things. Children have vivid imaginations after all. But the last time he went to the pool, he seemed different, distant, like he wasn't really there. When he looked at me, it was as if he was looking through me, as if he was already gone. She broke off, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, and Conrad felt an overwhelming sense of despair settle over him. He couldn't shake the image of Leo, staring into the water, seeing something that no one else could see. Research at the library. Haunted by Mrs. Baines's words, Conrad left and made his way to the local library, hoping to find records or accounts of similar incidents. He combed through newspaper archives and local records, reading about strange occurrences and ghostly apparitions that had plagued the town's pool house for decades. It was as if the pool had a life of its own, one that fed off the sorrow and fear of those who came too close. One article, dated nearly a century earlier, caught his eye. It detailed the account of a local fisherman who had claimed to see figures lurking beneath the water in the center of the lake upon which the recreation center was built. He described them as shadows with eyes that watched him, cold and predatory. The man had gone missing not long after the interview. Another article spoke of a ritual conducted by a group of people who believed the lake had the power to grant eternal life. They would immerse themselves in the lake, hoping to be reborn. But according to the article, many of them never surfaced. Their bodies never recovered. The lake, it seemed, was a place where the line between life and death was fragile, easily crossed, but never in reverse. Revelations from the past. As he continued his research, Conrad stumbled upon a thin, dusty journal tucked away in a forgotten corner of the library. The leather cover was cracked and worn, the pages brittle with age. Inside, he found entries detailing the life of a man named Amos, who had once worked at the recreation center. Amos described witnessing strange occurrences around the pool, the same footsteps, the same whispers that Conrad had experienced. The entries grew darker as Amos recounted dreams filled with water and darkness, dreams where he was trapped, unable to breathe, as shadowy hands reached for him. In one of the final entries, Amos wrote, "The pool is hungry. It waits, patient as ever, knowing its time will come again. I don't know how long I can resist. The whispers grow louder every night, and I fear that soon I will give in." Return to the pool house. Conrad left the library, his mind reeling from everything he had learned. There was no doubt in his mind now that the pool was haunted, a place where the veil between the living and the dead was dangerously thin. But there was something more sinister at work, something that seemed to hunger for the souls of those who came too close. As night fell, Conrad found himself drawn back to the recreation center, a dark resolve settling over him. He knew he was risking his life, but he couldn't turn back now. He had to find out what had happened to Jed, even if it meant confronting the entity that lurked in the depths of the pool. When he entered the pool house, he was met with the same eerie silence, the oppressive darkness pressing down on him from all sides. He approached the edge of the pool, feeling the weight of countless eyes watching him, waiting. He leaned over the edge, peering into the water, half expecting to see the twisted face of Leo or Jed staring back at him. But the water remained still, dark, impenetrable. Then, faintly, he heard it again, a whisper, just below the surface, calling his name. He felt the familiar pull, the invisible force urging him closer, promising answers, promising truth. And against every instinct screaming at him to run, he leaned in, letting the darkness envelop him, surrendering to the whispers as they drew him deeper into the abyss. In Chapter 2. Echoes in the dark, Conrad gathers information from the janitor and Leo's mother, unearthing terrifying details about the pool's haunting history. His research reveals the pool's role as a place where strange forces hold sway, leading him to face the dark reality of its deadly pull. As the chapter closes, Conrad steps closer to the pool's edge, teetering on the brink of the unknown, drawn by whispers that promise the answers he seeks at a terrifying price. Chapter 3. Into the Abyss. As night fell over Weinwick, Conrad found himself walking back to the pool house, guided by an invisible thread that he could neither explain nor resist. The weight of everything he'd learned bore down on him. The chilling accounts from Jed's letters, Eli's fear-filled recollections, and Mrs. Bain's despair over her son's last days. The pool house stood as a dark sentinel, daring him to uncover its secrets. But the knowledge he had gained thus far was fragmentary, haunting him with unanswered questions and disturbing possibilities. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth as Conrad approached the silent building. Above him, a thin layer of mist clung to the moon, casting an ethereal glow over the pool house. The water's dark surface reflected the faint light, giving it an almost mirror-like quality, as though it could trap anything that dared to look too long. Stepping inside, Conrad was greeted by an oppressive silence. It was as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching him, shadows moving at the edges of his vision. The dim lights cast elongated shapes that twisted and warped across the cracked tiles, giving life to the darkness that filled the pool house. He swallowed his fear and took a step closer to the edge of the pool. A ritual of curiosity and fear. As he stared into the black water, Conrad became aware of a strange pull, a magnetic force that seemed to emanate from the depths. The more he looked, the harder it became to pull his gaze away. The water, smooth and still, seemed to beckon him, promising answers hidden beneath its surface. The ripples of reality seemed to blur, and Conrad found himself entranced, leaning closer, drawn to whatever lay below. Then, in a whisper so faint he could barely make it out, he heard his name. "Conrad!" The voice was soft, filled with a familiar sadness. He froze, his heart pounding. As he strained to hear more, it was Jed's voice. There was no doubt about it. A chill crept up his spine as the voice grew louder, filling the room with a ghostly resonance. "Conrad, come closer. I need you." A surge of emotions overwhelmed him. Fear, curiosity, a painful longing to reach his lost friend. Without thinking, Conrad took another step forward, his feet inches from the edge. His mind flashed with memories of Jed, their late-night talks, shared laughter, and the bond that had once been as solid as the ground beneath him. Now, that ground felt like it was crumbling away. He leaned down, touching the surface of the water. It was ice cold, but as his fingers made contact, an intense heat pulsed through him, searing his skin. He jerked back, but the water rippled, and he caught a glimpse of something, a shadow moving just beneath the surface, writhing as if alive. A sickening feeling gripped him as he realized what he had seen. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a hand. A descent into memory. The image haunted him, and though every instinct screamed at him to run, he forced himself to remain still. He wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, a figment of his imagination, but a part of him knew better. The pool was alive, pulsing with an ancient, malevolent force, one that fed on fear and despair. He could feel it reaching out to him, a dark hunger emanating from the depths. Unable to resist, Conrad knelt at the pool's edge, staring into its inky blackness. He closed his eyes, hoping to gather his courage, but the darkness seemed to seep into his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like a suffocating fog. In his mind's eye, he saw flashes of images. A young boy, Leo, standing alone at the edge of the pool, his eyes wide with terror. Eli, pacing nervously, muttering to himself. Jed, standing at the pool's edge, his face pale, his eyes hollow. And then he saw himself, a shadowy reflection, staring into the pool, his expression mirroring the same fear and despair that had claimed the others. He felt a sinking sensation, as though he were being pulled into the visions, his consciousness slipping away into a vortex of memories that were not his own. The encounter, below, with a shudder, Conrad opened his eyes, finding himself still kneeling at the pool's edge. But something had changed. The water had grown darker, more viscous, and the air around him felt heavier, thick with an almost tangible darkness. Shadows swirled beneath the surface, growing bolder, their shapes shifting and contorting as though alive. He leaned closer, his heart pounding, and saw something that made his blood run cold. A face, faint and ghostly, staring up at him from the depths. It was Jed, his eyes wide with terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. Conrad's breath caught in his throat as he watched Jed's face drift closer, the details sharpening, becoming more real. He felt a pull, stronger than before, tugging at his mind, urging him to join Jed in the water. A voice echoed in his mind, soft and insistent. "Help me, Conrad. Please." In a moment of desperation, Conrad reached out, his hand hovering just above the water's surface. But as his fingers brushed the pool, a cold, wet grip tightened around his wrist, yanking him forward with a strength that defied reason. He struggled, gasping for air as the water's dark tendrils wrapped around him, pulling him down, deeper into the abyss. Visions of the past. As the water engulfed him, Conrad was plunged into a nightmare of shadow and memory. He saw flashes of the pool's history, fragments of time twisting and overlapping in a chaotic blur. He saw the old recreation center when it was first built, its bright lights reflecting on the water's surface. Families gathered, children laughed, unaware of the darkness that lay beneath. He saw the rituals, dark and twisted, performed in secrecy by those who believed the pool held a supernatural power. Hooded figures stood in a circle around the pool, chanting words that echoed with an otherworldly resonance. They were calling to something, summoning a force from the depths, one that would grant them power and eternal life. But the ritual went wrong. Instead of being blessed, they were cursed, their souls bound to the water, becoming one with the darkness. And then he saw Jed, trapped, his face pale and drawn, his eyes pleading. Conrad felt his friend's fear, his helplessness, as though it were his own. Jed had come too close to the truth, had seen too much, and now he was part of the pool's curse, a lost soul trapped in an endless cycle of suffering. The abyss beckons. The water grew colder, its embrace tightening around Conrad like a vice. He felt himself slipping, his consciousness fading as the shadows closed in. But a faint glimmer of light broke through the darkness, a tiny spark that ignited his will to fight. Summoning all his strength, he pushed against the pull of the water, kicking and thrashing as he struggled to break free. The shadows screamed, a sound that reverberated through his mind, a chorus of anger and despair. They clawed at him, tearing at his flesh, but he fought on, driven by a primal instinct to survive. His vision blurred, his lungs burned, but he refused to let go. Finally, with a surge of strength, he broke through the surface, gasping for air as he stumbled backward, collapsing onto the cold tiles. The shadows receded, slipping back into the depths of the pool, their anguished cries fading into silence. He lay there panting, his body trembling from the ordeal. The pool's surface was still once more, but he knew that the darkness had not been vanquished. It was still there, lurking beneath the water, waiting for the next soul to claim. A haunting realization. As he gathered himself, Conrad's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of what he had seen. The pool was a trap, a vessel for lost souls bound by ancient rituals and dark magic. The souls of the drowned, including Jed, were imprisoned within its depths, forced to relive their final moments in an endless cycle of despair. He felt a surge of anger, mixed with grief, as he thought of Jed, of the fear he must have felt in his final moments. His friend was lost, trapped in a place of darkness and suffering, and Conrad knew he couldn't leave him there. He had to find a way to break the curse, to free Jed and the others from the pool's grip. But he also knew that he couldn't do it alone. The darkness that lurked in the pool was ancient, powerful, a force beyond anything he had ever encountered. If he was going to confront it, he would need help, guidance, perhaps even the aid of those who had faced it before. A new determination. As he stumbled out of the pool house, the night air felt cold and unforgiving. Conrad looked back at the silent building, its darkened windows like hollow eyes staring back at him, mocking his weakness. But he refused to let the fear take hold. He would return, he promised himself, and he would find a way to free Jed, no matter the cost. His journey had only just begun, and he knew that the road ahead would be fraught with danger and uncertainty. But as he walked away from the pool house, a fierce determination burned within him. a resolve to uncover the truth and put an end to the darkness that had claimed his friend. For the first time since he had arrived in Weinwick, he felt a glimmer of hope. The pool house had tried to break him, to pull him into its depths, but he had survived, and as long as he held on to that strength, he knew he could face whatever horrors lay ahead. The shadows were gathering, the echoes of the past growing louder. But Conrad was ready. He would return to the pool house, prepared to confront the abyss, and he would not stop until he had freed the souls trapped within. In Chapter 3. Into the abyss, Conrad has a terrifying close encounter with the dark forces within the pool house, experiencing the haunting presence firsthand. He catches a glimpse of the pool's cursed history, of the rituals and souls bound to it. This experience strengthens his resolve to save Jed and the others, and he leaves with a new determination to break the curse no matter the cost. Chapter 4. The Drowned Boy's Secret. Conrad's return to the pool house the following evening came with a determination driven not only by his loyalty to Jed, but by a searing, unshakable need to uncover the true nature of the dark presence within its walls. He'd spent the previous night poring over Jed's letters, each line a haunting reminder of the horrors his friend had faced alone. As Conrad recalled Jed's warnings, a name echoed in his mind. Leo, the young boy who had drowned, had. In his desperation for answers, Conrad decided he had to follow the mystery of Leo's tragic fate. The history of Leo's drowning was shrouded in mystery, and Conrad sensed that the answers lay within the memories of the town itself. If he could unlock the secrets surrounding Leo, perhaps he could understand the chain of events that had led to Jed's disappearance and the monstrous forces binding them to the pool house. Determined to unearth the truth, Conrad found himself walking towards the town's cemetery, hoping that by starting with Leo, he could finally piece together the web of darkness that hung over the pool house. Revisit to Leo's grave. The cemetery lay just beyond the outskirts of Weinwick, nestled in a forgotten grove of twisted trees that seemed to have grown crooked from years of absorbing the sorrow of those interred within its gates. Fog rolled across the ground in thick blankets, shrouding the tombstones in a ghostly mist. Conrad made his way through the overgrown path, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He reached the modest grave of Leo Baines, his heart heavy as he knelt beside the tombstone. Leo's grave was worn, the words etched into the stone barely visible beneath a layer of moss. Conrad brushed his hand over the stone, his fingers tracing the letters of Leo's name, feeling a surge of sorrow for the boy who had died so young. "Leo," Conrad murmured softly, almost as if expecting an answer. "I know you saw something that day in the pool house. I need to know what it was." The air around him grew colder, and a whisper floated through the trees, a faint, childlike giggle that sent a chill down his spine. The fog seemed to thicken, curling around the tombstones like spectral fingers, and for a moment, Conrad thought he saw the outline of a small figure standing just beyond the edge of his vision. But when he blinked, the figure vanished, leaving only an eerie silence. Conrad took a deep breath, pushing aside his fear. He felt an inexplicable connection to Leo, a bond forged through shared pain and the haunting knowledge that they had both glimpsed into the same darkness. Before he left, he placed a small, worn token, a keepsake from his own childhood, on Leo's grave as a gesture of respect, a silent promise that he would do whatever it took to bring peace to the boy's restless soul. Met the church and Father Elias. Determined to learn more about the circumstances of Leo's death, Conrad's next stop was the town's small, centuries-old church. He hoped that Father Elias, the town's priest, might be able to shed light on any strange occurrences that had taken place around the time of Leo's death. The church loomed ahead, its stone walls covered in ivy, the Gothic spire piercing the night sky. Inside, the candle-lit interior cast shadows across the rows of empty pews, and the faint smell of incense hung in the air. Father Elias, an elderly man with deep-set eyes and a stooped posture, greeted Conrad with a somber expression. "Father Elias, I've come to ask about Leo Baines," Conrad said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet urgency. "I believe he saw something terrible before he died." The priest's face tightened, and he cast a wary glance around the empty church, as if fearing the shadows might be listening. "Leo, yes, Father Elias murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I remember him well. He was a quiet boy, curious and full of life. But in those last days, something changed. He would come here often, seeking comfort, telling me about things he'd seen. The priest paused, his eyes darkening as though the memories were too painful to recall. After a long silence, he continued. He told me he'd seen someone in the pool house, a boy like him but twisted, wrong. He said the boy would stand in the water, waiting, calling to him. I tried to comfort him, told him it was just his imagination. But the fear in his eyes, I've never seen anything like it. Father Elias sighed, his gaze distant. A few days later, Leo drowned. His mother was inconsolable, and I began to question myself. Did I fail him? Should I have listened? The pool house. It has always been a place of sorrow. But since that day, I've sensed something darker lurking there, something beyond my understanding. Conrad felt a surge of determination, realizing that Leo had been trying to warn those around him. Whatever he'd seen had been real, and it had drawn him to his death. Conrad knew he couldn't leave without finding out more. The legend of the pool. Father Elias led Conrad to a small back room filled with books and relics, his fingers tracing the spines of worn leather-bound volumes. He selected a faded manuscript, opening it to a page marked with an ancient symbol, resembling a swirling whirlpool. This is the oldest record I could find on the pool, Father Elias explained. It was built over a natural spring, long believed to have mystical properties. Some of the early settlers believed the spring was cursed, that it housed a spirit tied to the water. There were rumors of people who had disappeared in its depths, of shadows lurking just beneath the surface. They tried to contain it, to bind it, but Father Elias trailed off, his gaze haunted. Over the years, the town forgot, but I've always believed that some part of that curse remains, waiting, feeding off those who come too close. And now, I fear it has claimed your friend. The priest's words sent a chill through Conrad, solidifying his resolve to uncover the truth. He thanked Father Elias and made his way back to the pool house, his mind racing with the knowledge he had gained. Whatever darkness lingered within the pool, it was ancient, a force tied to the very foundation of the town itself. Return to the pool house. As he entered the pool house once more, the oppressive silence seemed to deepen, as if the shadows were aware of his presence, waiting for him to make a move. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon him, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Taking a deep breath, he stepped to the edge of the pool, gazing into the inky blackness. Leo, he whispered, his voice barely audible, if you can hear me, show me what you saw. For a long moment, nothing happened. The water remained still, unyielding. But then, slowly, the surface began to ripple, distorting his reflection into a twisted, ghostly image. A chill washed over him as he saw the outline of a small figure materialize in the water. A young boy, standing just beneath the surface, his face pale and expressionless. Conrad's breath caught in his throat as the boy's eyes met his, filled with a sorrow so profound it was almost unbearable. The boy raised his hand, pointing to the center of the pool, his mouth opening as if to speak. Conrad strained to hear, his heart pounding. But instead of words, a haunting melody drifted through the pool house, a faint, eerie tune, like a lullaby sung in a child's voice. The sound echoed off the walls, filling the space with an overwhelming sense of sadness and longing. The boy's image began to fade, sinking deeper into the water, but the melody continued, growing louder, more insistent. It was as though the pool itself were singing, calling out to Conrad, urging him to understand. The lure of the abyss. The song tugged at him, drawing him closer to the edge of the pool. He felt an overwhelming urge to lean forward, to immerse himself in the water, to follow the melody to its source. But as he reached out, his fingers inches from the surface, he heard a faint whisper, Jed's voice calling his name, filled with a desperate plea. Conrad, don't! The whisper broke through the trance, snapping him back to reality. He stumbled back, his heart pounding as he stared at the pool, its surface once again calm, the melody fading into silence. He knew now that the pool was more than just haunted. It was a vessel, a conduit for something far darker than he had imagined. The spirits of those who had died there were trapped, bound to the water by an ancient curse, their souls crying out for release. And at the heart of it all was Leo, the young boy who had seen too much, whose innocence had been stolen by the darkness lurking within the pool. Baumann ein Arm for the new understanding. Conrad left the pool house, his mind racing with the revelations he had uncovered. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, and he realized that the only way to save Jed, to break the curse, was to confront the entity head-on. But he couldn't do it alone. He would need allies, those who understood the pool's dark history, who had the knowledge to help him perform a ritual that could banish the darkness once and for all. He knew it would be dangerous, that he was facing forces beyond his comprehension. But he couldn't turn back now. Leo, Jed, and the other lost souls depended on him, their fates entwined with his own. As he walked away from the pool house, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him, a quiet resolve that steadied his nerves. He had glimpsed the darkness, understood its nature, and he knew what he had to do. The pool house would no longer be a place of fear and sorrow. He would reclaim it, free the trapped souls, and bring an end to the curse that had haunted Weinwick for generations. But even as he steeled himself for the battles to come, he couldn't shake the feeling that the pool house was watching him, waiting for his return. The darkness had tasted his fear, and it would not let him go so easily. In Chapter 4, The Drowned Boy's Secret, Conrad learns of Leo's tragic death and its connection to the cursed pool. Through his encounters with Father Elias and Leo's spirit, he realizes that the pool house is a gateway for an ancient evil, bound by dark rituals. Determined to free the trapped souls, he leaves with a newfound purpose, ready to face the entity lurking within the pool. Chapter 5, Haunted Waters. Conrad returned to the pool house the following evening, his mind sharp with a mixture of dread and resolve. The haunting melody he'd heard the night before echoed faintly in his mind, like a lingering spell, refusing to let go. He had spent the day trying to piece together the fractured truths he'd uncovered, the eerie history of the pool, the curse from ancient rituals, and the spirits of lost souls like Leo bound to the darkness. As he approached the pool house, the air felt heavy, thick with an energy that pulsed with a malevolent life of its own. The fog that blanketed the town had gathered thickly around the building, wrapping it in a shroud of ghostly mist. Shadows twisted and shifted on the cracked pavement, moving with a life of their own, their shapes distorted as they danced beneath the dim streetlight. Conrad paused at the pool house doors, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on him, as if the pool house itself were watching, waiting. He took a deep breath, gathering his courage, and pushed open the doors, and entering the pool house. The familiar scent of dampness and chlorine greeted him as he stepped inside, the darkness pressing in on him from all sides. The faint light from the overhead fixtures cast long, eerie shadows across the room, distorting the edges of reality and blurring the line between this world and the next. As he approached the pool, Conrad felt an inexplicable pull, an urge to look deeper, to descend further into the mysteries that lay hidden beneath the water's surface. The pool itself was a still, black void, stretching out like an endless abyss. It seemed to absorb the light, drawing in every glimmer and reflection, giving nothing back. Then, faintly, he heard it again, the soft, haunting melody, drifting through the air like a lullaby sung from the depths of the water. He took a step closer, his gaze locked on the pool, and felt the air around him grow colder, the chill seeping into his bones. The melody grew louder, each note resonating with an ancient sorrow that echoed through the empty space, filling it with a sense of despair. A presence. Unseen, Conrad closed his eyes, allowing himself to fall into the music, to let it guide him. The melody wrapped around him, weaving a web of emotions, fear, sorrow, longing, that seemed to reach into the deepest corners of his soul. He felt a strange sensation, as though the music were alive, probing his thoughts, his memories, pulling him further into its spell. As he opened his eyes, he saw a figure standing at the far end of the pool. It was a child, his features shadowed, his form barely visible in the dim light. But there was something unmistakably eerie about the boy's presence, something that sent a chill down Conrad's spine. The boy lifted his head, his eyes meeting Conrad's. And in that moment, Conrad felt a surge of recognition. This was Leo. The child stared at him, his eyes empty, filled with an ancient sorrow that seemed to stretch back through centuries of darkness. "Leo," Conrad whispered, his voice barely audible. The boy tilted his head, his gaze unwavering, and Conrad felt a cold, invisible hand wrap around his heart, squeezing it with a relentless grip. The boy's mouth opened, and from his lips came the same haunting melody, sung in a voice that was both childlike and ageless, as though it carried the weight of countless lost souls. The lullaby of the lost, the melody filled the pool house, echoing off the walls, growing louder and more insistent. It was a song of loss, of despair, a lament for those who had been drawn into the darkness, never to return. As Conrad listened, he felt a wave of emotions wash over him, emotions that were not his own. He felt the terror of drowning, the suffocating weight of water pressing down on him, the desperate struggle to breathe. He saw flashes of faces, men, women, children, all of them staring up at him from beneath the surface, their eyes wide with fear, their mouths open in silent screams. They were trapped, bound to the pool by a force they could not escape, their souls forever entwined with the darkness. The melody grew louder, each note cutting into him like a blade, filling him with a despair so profound it threatened to consume him. He felt himself slipping, his mind unraveling as he fell deeper into the spell of the music. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the melody stopped, leaving a silence so intense it felt as though the air itself had been sucked out of the room. Conrad staggered back, his heart pounding, his body trembling from the intensity of the experience. He looked around, but the boy was gone, leaving only the faint echo of the melody lingering in the air. A message from the past. As he stood there, trying to regain his composure, Conrad's gaze fell on something glinting at the edge of the pool. He walked over, kneeling down to pick it up, and found himself holding a small, tarnished locket. The metal was worn, the edges frayed, but as he opened it, he saw a photograph inside, a faded image of Leo smiling, his eyes bright with innocence. A wave of sadness washed over him as he stared at the locket, feeling the weight of Leo's loss pressing down on him. This was a boy who had been full of life, who had known happiness, and yet he had been drawn into the darkness, his soul bound to a place of sorrow and despair. As he held the locket, Conrad felt a strange warmth spreading through his hand, a faint pulsing sensation, as though the locket were alive, resonating with an energy of its own. He heard a faint whisper, a voice that was barely audible, but unmistakably Leo's. "Help me." The words were filled with a desperate plea, a cry for release from the torment that held him captive. Conrad felt a surge of determination, a resolve that burned within him. He couldn't leave Leo here, trapped in a place of darkness, bound to the pool house by a force he could not escape. For an ancient ritual, as he searched the pool house for answers, Conrad's mind returned to the journal he'd found in the library. The ritual described there had been vague, the details fragmented. But he recalled the references to an ancient rite that could sever the bonds between the living and the dead. It was a dangerous ritual, one that required a sacrifice of the self, a willingness to confront the darkness and face the spirits within. He gathered the necessary items, a candle, salt, and a small mirror, symbols of protection and reflection. As he arranged them around the pool, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him, a quiet determination that steadied his nerves. He lit the candle, its flickering light casting long shadows across the pool house, and began to chant the words he had memorized from the journal, his voice low and steady. The air grew colder, the shadows deepening, and he felt a presence gathering around him, as though the spirits of the pool house were watching, waiting. The water began to ripple, small waves spreading across the surface, and he felt a surge of energy rising from the depths, a force that pulsed with a life of its own. The candle flickered, its flames struggling against an unseen wind, and he felt a chill seep into his bones, filling him with a fear so intense it threatened to break his resolve. But he continued to chant, his voice growing louder, more insistent, as he called upon the spirits of the pool house to reveal themselves, to release their hold on the souls trapped within. Fa-chum-si, the darkness awakens. The water's surface broke, and from the depths rose a dark, swirling mass, a shadow that twisted and contorted, taking on a shape that was both human and monstrous. Its eyes were hollow, filled with an ancient hunger, and it stretched out a hand, reaching for him with fingers made of darkness. Conrad felt a wave of terror wash over him, but he stood his ground, meeting the creature's gaze with a determination that burned within him. He held up the mirror, the reflection of the shadow staring back at it, and he saw the faces of the lost souls, Leo, Jed, and countless others, trapped within its depths. "Release them," he demanded, his voice steady, filled with a strength he hadn't known he possessed. "Let them go," the creature hissed, its form shifting, writhing, as though it were struggling against an invisible force. The faces within the shadow stared back at him, their eyes pleading, filled with a sorrow that cut into him like a knife. "Help us!" the voices echoed, a chorus of despair that filled the room, drowning out all other sounds. Conrad took a step forward, holding the mirror steady, the reflection growing brighter, more intense, as though it were drawing the darkness into itself. Pulling the shadow back into the depths, the creature shrieked, its form dissolving, twisting, as it was pulled into the mirror, its hollow eyes wide with fear. And then, with a final agonized scream, it vanished, leaving only the stillness of the pool house and the faint echo of the voices lingering in the air. As the souls set free, the water grew calm, its surface still, and Conrad felt a warmth spreading through the room, a lightness that filled the air, lifting the weight of sorrow that had hung over the pool house. He saw the faint outlines of the souls, the faces of Leo, Jed, and the others, fading, their expressions peaceful, free from the torment that had bound them to this place. A tear slipped down Conrad's cheek as he watched them disappear, their souls released from the darkness, moving on to a place beyond the reach of the pool house's curse. He felt a sense of relief, a quiet peace that settled over him, and he knew that the spirits were finally at rest, freed from the torment that had held them captive for so long. As he gathered his belongings and made his way out of the pool house, he looked back one last time, feeling a sense of closure, a finality that filled him with a bittersweet joy. The pool house was still, silent, its shadows no longer twisting with the presence of the lost souls. For the first time since he had arrived in Weinwick, Conrad felt free. The darkness that had haunted him, that had threatened to consume him, was gone, and he knew that he had brought peace to those who had suffered within the pool house's walls. And as he walked away, the faint melody of the lullaby drifted through the air one last time, a song of release, of freedom, a final goodbye from the souls who had found their peace. In Chapter 5, Haunted Waters, Conrad confronts the pool house's dark spirit, performing an ancient ritual to release the trapped souls. He frees Leo, Jed, and others from the pool's curse, bringing peace to those bound by darkness. Chapter 6. The Abyss Stirs. Conrad left the pool house that night, believing he had finally freed the trapped souls within, the spirits of Leo, Jed, and countless others who had been lost to the water's dark embrace. But as he walked back to his small rented room on the outskirts of Weinwick, an unsettling thought gnawed at him. Though he had felt the warmth of release and seen the peace settle over their faces, a deep unease lingered in the pit of his stomach. It was as though a part of the darkness had stayed behind, clinging to him, refusing to let go. As dawn broke, Conrad tried to sleep, but his rest was plagued with fractured dreams. He saw dark, shadowed shapes looming over him, heard faint whispers, echoes of voices that called out from the depths. In each dream, he stood alone at the edge of the pool, feeling the weight of invisible eyes, the pull of an endless void beneath the surface. The water was calm, yet he sensed something lurking just beneath, watching, waiting. Every time he tried to look closer, he would wake, his heart racing, his skin clammy with a cold sweat. It wasn't over. He could feel it, a presence that lingered just beyond his reach, elusive but ever watchful. A new, unsettling discovery. The following morning, with fatigue weighing heavily on him, Conrad returned to the library, driven by an instinct that he couldn't ignore. He had spent hours here before, combing through old records, reading accounts of mysterious drownings and strange happenings. But something drew him back, as though the library held a hidden key, a final answer to the mystery of the pool. He approached the librarian, Mrs. Calloway, who had grown accustomed to his frequent visits. She was an elderly woman with sharp, inquisitive eyes and an air of quiet wisdom. She seemed to sense the change in him, the haunted look that shadowed his gaze. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Mr. Conrad," she remarked, her voice soft but penetrating. Conrad managed a weak smile. "In a way, I suppose I have." Mrs. Calloway regarded him for a long moment before nodding and leading him to a section of the library he hadn't noticed before. A small, dusty room tucked away at the end of a narrow corridor. The walls were lined with ancient tomes, their spines cracked and faded, the air thick with the scent of aged paper and ink. "This is our private archive," she explained, handing him a large leather-bound book. Town records, personal accounts, journals that the townsfolk didn't want to leave out in the open. "Perhaps you'll find what you're looking for here." Conrad thanked her and sat down at a small wooden desk, the only source of light a dim lamp that cast a weak yellow glow. As he opened the book, he was struck by a peculiar feeling, as though he were peeling back layers of the town's darkest secrets, secrets that had been buried beneath generations of silence. The origin of the pool's curse. As he read through the pages, Conrad uncovered a series of accounts that detailed the pool's construction and the strange occurrences that had begun almost immediately afterward. The pool had been built over a natural spring, a place that local legends claimed was a gateway to another realm. The earliest settlers in Weinwick had believed that the spring held a dark power, an ancient spirit that was bound to the water. They called it the Abyss Stirs, a name that sent chills down Conrad's spine. According to the accounts, the town's elders had known of the spring's power, its pull on the souls of the living. They had tried to contain it, constructing the pool as a form of barrier, a way to hold the spirit at bay. But the construction itself had awakened the abyss, angering it, and since then the pool had become a place of tragedy, claiming the lives of those who ventured too close. He read an entry written by a woman named Beatrice Eldron, a midwife who had been one of the few to witness the abyss in its true form. Her words were scrawled in frantic, uneven handwriting, each sentence filled with a palpable sense of terror. "The abyss is not merely water, nor is it spirit. It is a hunger, a force that consumes, that reaches out for the souls of the living. I have seen its shadow rise from the depths, seen it claim those who dared to look too closely. It watches, it waits, and when it chooses, it pulls them under, binds them to itself. No prayer, no ritual can appease it. It is eternal, a curse that lies at the heart of our town." Beatrice had attempted a ritual to banish the abyss, but her efforts had only strengthened its hold on the pool. She wrote of shadows rising from the water, taking the shape of those who had drowned, their faces twisted in torment. She had left the town soon after, warning that the abyss would one day claim all who ventured near. Conrad felt a chill settle over him as he closed the book. This wasn't just a haunting. The abyss was a force beyond human comprehension, an entity that had waited centuries, feeding off the souls of those drawn to its depths, and now it had taken Jed. A strange encounter. Leaving the library, Conrad walked through the quiet streets of Weinwick, his mind reeling from the weight of the secrets he had uncovered. He knew he couldn't face the abyss alone. But who could he turn to? The townsfolk were wary, steeped in fear and superstition. He needed someone who understood the darkness, who could help him confront the entity without being consumed by it. As he rounded a corner, he nearly collided with an old man leaning heavily on a wooden cane. The man's eyes were a piercing blue, sharp and clear despite his age. He wore a long coat and a worn hat, his features gaunt but alert. "You're Conrad," the the man said, his voice rough but steady. The one who's been stirring up things better left alone. Conrad regarded him with surprise. Who are you? Name's Silas, the old man replied, his gaze unflinching. I knew your friend Jed, and I know what you're after. Silas motioned for Conrad to follow him, and together they walked to a secluded bench beneath an ancient oak tree. There, Silas spoke in a low voice, his words filled with the weight of years spent in close proximity to the darkness. The abyss. It's not something you can simply banish, Silas began, his tone grave. It's not just a curse. It's a hunger, a force that feeds on the fear, the sorrow, the desperation of those it ensnares. It doesn't want to be freed. It wants to consume, to expand its reach beyond the pool. Conrad listened, feeling the depth of Silas's understanding, the old man's words resonating with the grim accounts he'd read. Silas went on to describe how he had encountered the abyss in his youth, how he had lost friends to its pull, watching helplessly as they drowned, their souls slipping into the darkness. It called to me too, Silas admitted, his eyes distant, haunted. But I resisted. It was the only way to keep my sanity. Once it gets a hold of you, even just a little, it never lets go. The ritual of confrontation. Silas explained that there was only one way to confront the abyss directly, a ritual that required total immersion, a complete surrender to the darkness. It was a rite of passage, a test of the soul's strength, where one could either emerge victorious or be claimed forever. You'll need to go to the heart of the pool, Silas said, his voice low and steady. You'll face the abyss and it will show you its true form. But beware, Conrad. Once you look into it, once you see it for what it is, it will know you. It will never forget. Conrad nodded, feeling the weight of the decision before him. He knew there was no turning back, that this was the only way to save Jed, to free the souls trapped within the pool's depths. As night fell, he made his way back to the pool house, Silas's words echoing in his mind. He prepared himself, gathering the items he would need for the ritual: a mirror, a candle, and a vial of salt water blessed by Silas. The items felt heavy in his hands, symbols of protection that offered only a fragile barrier against the darkness. The descent into the abyss. The pool house was silent as he entered, the darkness thicker than usual, pressing in on him from all sides. He lit the candle, its weak flame flickering as he approached the pool. The water was as black as ink, its surface smooth and unbroken, reflecting the faint light in a twisted, distorted mirror. Taking a deep breath, Conrad stepped to the edge of the pool. Holding the mirror in one hand, the candle in the other, he looked down, his gaze fixed on his own reflection, and began to chant the words Silas had taught him, calling upon the spirits of the lost, summoning the abyss to reveal itself. At first, there was only silence, but then slowly, the water began to ripple, the surface shifting as though something were stirring beneath. The candle flickered, the flame guttering as the temperature dropped, a bone-chilling cold seeping into the air. The shadows deepened, twisting and merging, forming a shape that rose from the depths. It was a figure, its form shrouded in darkness, its eyes empty voids that seemed to consume the light. Conrad stared into the creature's gaze, feeling a wave of terror wash over him. The abyss was not just a force, it was a consciousness, a malevolent intelligence that fed on his fear, his sorrow. It knew him, understood him, in a way that was both intimate and horrifying. Confronting the darkness, the creature's voice filled his mind, a whisper that echoed with the weight of centuries, the voices of countless souls woven together in a chorus of despair. "Why do you resist, Conrad?" the abyss murmured, its tone both mocking and curious. "You are like all the others, drawn to the darkness, yearning to understand. But there is nothing to understand, only emptiness, only hunger." Conrad gripped the mirror tightly, forcing himself to hold the creature's gaze. "I'm here to free them," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. "To free Jed, to release the souls you've taken." The abyss laughed, a hollow sound that reverberated through the pool house, shaking the walls. "Foolish boy, they are mine. They belong to me. bound by their own despair. And you will join them. The creature reached out, its shadowed hand stretching toward him, tendrils of darkness wrapping around his arm, pulling him closer. Conrad felt a surge of terror, the cold seeping into his skin, freezing him from the inside out. But he clutched the mirror, holding it up to the creature's face, forcing it to confront its own reflection. The darkness writhed, twisting and contorting, as though repelled by its own image. The tendrils loosened, and for a brief moment, Conrad saw something within the abyss, a glimmer of light, a fragment of the souls it had consumed. With a surge of strength, Conrad held the mirror steady, his voice rising as he chanted the final words of the ritual. The light grew, pushing back the darkness, illuminating the faces of the lost souls trapped within the abyss. He saw Jed, his face filled with sorrow, and reached out to him, their hands almost touching. "Jed," Conrad whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of hope and despair. I'm here to bring you home." The creature shrieked, a sound that pierced the air, its form dissolving as the light intensified. The darkness retreated, pulling away from Conrad, its grip weakening as the ritual took hold. In a final desperate act, the abyss lunged toward him, its eyes filled with a hatred so intense it burned through him. But Conrad held his ground, the mirror a shield that repelled the creature, forcing it back into the depths. With a final scream, the abyss vanished, its form dissolving into the water, leaving only the faint echo of its laughter lingering in the air. A new dawn. As the first light of dawn broke through the windows, Conrad collapsed onto the floor, his body trembling from the ordeal. The pool was calm, its surface smooth and still, the darkness gone. The souls had been freed, their torment lifted, their spirits released. He looked down at the mirror in his hand, seeing his own reflection, pale and weary but filled with a quiet strength. He had faced the abyss, confronted the darkness, and emerged victorious. But as he stood, he knew that a part of the abyss would always linger, a shadow that would follow him, a reminder of the darkness he had faced. He walked away from the pool house, his steps heavy, his heart burdened, but filled with a sense of peace. The curse had been broken, the souls were free, and for the first time, Conrad felt the weight of their gratitude, their voices whispering a final, gentle farewell as he left the pool house behind, the shadows dissolving in the light of a new day. Chapter 7. The Abyss Beckons. When Conrad finally emerged from the pool house, he felt as though he'd escaped a nightmare. Yet the town of Weinwick, usually draped in familiar fog, seemed foreign to him, its edges warped, the shadows stretching in odd, unsettling ways. The abyss's darkness had been broken, the curse seemingly lifted, but the faint whispers from his final encounter lingered in the corners of his mind. With each passing day, he realized he couldn't escape what he'd encountered in the abyss. Something had changed. As he walked through town, faces looked familiar but out of place, and he sensed the townspeople watching him with wary eyes. His gaze met only quick, uncomfortable glances, as though the townspeople knew something he didn't. Even when they greeted him, their expressions held a veiled unease. Conrad had freed the souls, yes, but he began to wonder if he'd freed himself, or if he'd merely carried the abyss out with him. Strange shadows and flickering lights. That night, back in his rented room, he first noticed the strange occurrences. The soft, flickering light of his bedside candle started to cast unusual shadows on the walls, which seemed to move independently. He lay awake, listening as the silence deepened, and then he heard it. A faint, echoing voice calling his name. The voice was quiet at first, a soft murmur that could have been his imagination. But as the night wore on, it grew louder, sharper, as if someone were whispering directly into his ear. "Conrad, come back, come back." His heart thudded heavily in his chest as he sat up, glancing around the darkened room. He could feel something watching him. A presence just out of sight, waiting, lurking. The air was thick, oppressive, as though the walls themselves held their breath. He forced himself to lie down again, repeating to himself that it was only his mind playing tricks on him, but sleep eluded him, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same image, a dark, swirling void pulling him down, drowning him in its depths. He could feel its cold touch, the way it wrapped around him, suffocating him. His dreams became an endless cycle of being trapped, sinking into the black waters, only to wake gasping for air. Can mam teaser, unsettling visits and old secrets. The following morning, exhausted and disoriented, Conrad found himself wandering through Weinwick, hoping the fresh air might clear his mind. But the streets were unusually empty, and the few townsfolk he encountered avoided his gaze, their expressions guarded. The sensation that he didn't truly belong here grew stronger with every step. Then, as he passed the church, he caught sight of Father Elias standing by the gate, his gaze fixed intently on Conrad. The priest beckoned him over and Conrad hesitated, a chill creeping up his spine. Father Elias's face was grave, his eyes dark with worry. "I've heard things, Conrad," he said quietly. "Whispers in the night. Townsfolk who swear they've seen shadows that shouldn't be there. Reflections that linger just a little too long. I fear that in breaking the abyss's hold on the pool house, you may have stirred something deeper." Conrad's pulse quickened. I thought I freed them. I thought I ended it." Father Elias shook his head slowly. "The abyss is older than any curse, older than our town itself. You may have freed the trapped souls, but something ancient remains, something that once connected with you, that knows you now." The priest placed a hand on his shoulder. "There are stories, Conrad, tales of those who have looked into the abyss and carried its darkness with them. It's a mark, a scar on the soul that cannot be easily healed." As Conrad listened, a sense of foreboding washed over him. It was as if the abyss had become a part of him, a shadow that lurked in the depths of his mind. The priest's words stayed with him, filling him with a sense of inevitability that he couldn't shake. The mirror in the room. That night, back in his room, Conrad avoided the mirror. It stood on the far side of the room, a large, old-fashioned piece with an ornate, tarnished frame. He hadn't paid much attention to it before, but now it seemed to draw him in, as though something waited for him on the other side of the glass. Unable to resist, he finally approached the mirror, staring at his own reflection. For a long moment everything seemed normal. His face, pale and weary, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. But then, as he continued to stare, he noticed something strange. His reflection's eyes seemed darker, emptier, like twin voids that absorbed the light. And then it happened. His reflection blinked, a slow, deliberate movement that did not match his own. Conrad felt a chill run down his spine as he watched his reflection take on a life of its own, moving, shifting, a faint smile curving its lips. "You can't escape me," the reflection whispered, its voice barely audible, a hollow, echoing sound that seemed to come from within his own mind. He stumbled back, his heart racing, as the reflection continued to watch him, its smile growing wider, more menacing. Conrad turned away, trying to steady his breathing, but the image of his reflection lingered in his mind, haunting him. The darkness wasn't gone. It had simply changed its form. The first descent. Desperate for answers, Conrad returned to the pool house the following day, hoping to find some way to sever the connection. The building loomed before him, silent and empty, the faint scent of chlorine hanging in the air. He made his way to the edge of the pool, gazing into the still black water. The surface was calm, but as he stared into its depths, he felt a familiar pull, an invitation that reached out to him from the darkness below. He closed his eyes, letting himself fall into a trance, allowing the abyss to guide him once more. As he opened his eyes, he found himself submerged, floating in a dark, endless void. Shadows swirled around him, forming vague shapes that danced and twisted, merging and separating in an endless fluid motion. He felt a presence nearby, something ancient and powerful watching him from the depths. "Why have you returned, Conrad?" The voice echoed through the void, a hollow sound that reverberated in his mind. "I didn't return by choice," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You're still with me. I can't escape you." The shadows coalesced into a shape, a figure that was both familiar and alien, its face a distorted version of his own. It smiled, a twisted, mocking expression that filled him with dread. "We are one now, Conrad," it said softly. "You looked into the abyss, and it looked back. You can never leave. You belong to me." The meeting with Silas. Terrified and shaken, Conrad fled from the pool house, feeling the weight of the abyss pressing down on him. He was lost, trapped in a cycle of fear and despair, unable to escape the darkness that had taken hold of his soul. In his desperation, he sought out Silas, the old man who had warned him about the abyss. Silas listened quietly as Conrad described the visions, the whispers, the way his own reflection had seemed to take on a life of its own. Silas nodded slowly, his expression grave. "The abyss is a hungry thing, Conrad. Once it has tasted your fear, it will never let go. It sees you as its own, a part of itself, and it will haunt you until you surrender to it." Conrad felt a surge of despair, but Silas placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "There is one way," he said softly. "A ritual that might sever the bond, but it requires a sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" Conrad asked, though he already knew the answer. Silas's eyes darkened. "You must confront the abyss within yourself, accept it fully, and then give up a piece of yourself in return. Only then will it release its hold." And the ritual of severance. That night, Conrad prepared for the ritual, gathering the items Silas had instructed him to find: a black candle, a vial of water from the pool, and a small silver knife. He lit the candle, its flame casting flickering shadows across the room, and knelt on the floor, the vial and knife laid before him. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, and began to chant the words Silas had taught him, his voice steady, each syllable resonating with power. As he chanted, he felt the air grow colder, the shadows deepening around him, and he sensed the presence of the abyss watching him, waiting. Slowly, he lifted the knife, pressing its blade against his palm, and allowed a few drops of blood to fall into the vial of water. The mixture bubbled, the water darkening, and he felt a surge of energy, a connection between himself and the abyss that pulsed with a life of its own. As the ritual continued, he felt a strange sensation, a pull from within, as though something were being drawn out of him. The shadows grew thicker, wrapping around him, pressing against him, suffocating him. He struggled to breathe, feeling the darkness clawing at his soul, trying to drag him down, but he held firm, his voice rising as he chanted the final words, a defiance that filled him with a strength he hadn't known he possessed. With the final confrontation, in that moment, the abyss materialized before him, its form shifting and writhing, a dark mirror of his own image. It stared at him with eyes that burned with hunger, its voice a whisper that filled the room. "You think you can escape me, Conrad?" It sneered, its voice dripping with malice. "I am part of you. I am the darkness within." Conrad stared back, his gaze unwavering. "You are a shadow, nothing more. I accept that you are a part of me, but you do not control me." The abyss shrieked, its form twisting and contorting, and he felt its grip weaken, its hold slipping as he completed the ritual. The shadows around him dissipated, the air clearing, and he felt a weight lift from his soul, a lightness that filled him with peace. With a final scream, the abyss vanished, its form dissolving into the darkness, leaving only silence. A new dawn. Conrad sat alone in the quiet room, the candle's flame flickering softly. The abyss was gone, its hold broken, and for the first time, he felt free. The shadows had retreated, the whispers silenced, and he knew that he had finally severed the bond that had haunted him. As he stepped out into the morning light, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a strength that came from knowing he had overcome the darkness. The road ahead was uncertain, but he walked forward with a quiet confidence, leaving the shadows of the abyss behind. Chapter 8. The Abyss. Gazes back. But Conrad thought he had left the darkness behind in the pool house. He believed that he had finally broken the connection, that the abyss no longer held him in its grasp. Yet, as he walked through the streets of Weinwick, he felt a growing sense of unease. The town looked the same as ever, with its weather-beaten homes and silent, fog-covered streets. But the air was heavy, thick with a presence he couldn't explain. The abyss was gone, or so he'd thought, but some shadow, some intangible feeling had lingered. Over the next few days, Conrad tried to return to normalcy, but the world around him felt subtly altered. He would find himself staring into reflections, windows, pools of rainwater, the mirrors in his rented room, and for an instant he would glimpse movement behind him, something dark, fleeting, and unrecognizable. It was as if the abyss had left an imprint on him, a subtle echo that lurked just out of sight. Unsettling realizations. The dreams began almost immediately after his final confrontation at the pool house, and they grew increasingly vivid with each passing night. In these dreams, he would wander through the shadowed streets of a strange, distorted version of Weinwick. The town seemed to stretch and warp around him, streets turning into endless corridors, homes melding into darkened ruins. The people in his dreams, familiar faces from town, old friends he hadn't seen in years, were there, but they were different. Their eyes were empty, hollow. They spoke to him in whispers, their voices layered with echoes, and each word held the same message, repeated over and over. You're still marked, Conrad. The abyss sees you. Every night, he would wake drenched in sweat, the echoes of their voices lingering in his mind. He began to feel watched, haunted, as though a shadow was lurking just outside his vision, waiting for him to look away. Every reflective surface became a threat, every sound in the quiet of his room a reminder of the presence that clung to him. Even though he had freed the souls trapped in the pool, something remained, something insidious and patient. A return to Father Elias. Desperate for answers, Conrad went to the church, seeking out Father Elias. The priest listened quietly, his face drawn and serious as Conrad described the dreams, the feeling of being watched, the fleeting glimpses of movement in mirrors and glass. Father Elias seemed unsurprised, a sadness in his eyes that told Conrad the priest had perhaps suspected as much. The abyss is a place without time, Father Elias said, his voice barely a whisper. It's not bound by our world, not in the way we understand. When you severed the connection, you may have freed the souls that were bound to it, but you did not destroy the abyss itself. A part of it lingers. Conrad felt a chill run down his spine. Are you saying it's still here? That it can still reach me? Father Elias nodded, his gaze fixed on some unseen point in the distance. The abyss has known you, Conrad. It has seen into your soul, and you into it. You can't sever such a bond without leaving something behind. You may have left the pool, but the abyss still carries a part of you, and if it wishes, it may call you back. Conrad's mind raced with the priest's words. He had confronted the darkness, stared into the abyss, and now it seemed the abyss was staring back. The mark of the abyss. Over the following days, the visions intensified. Conrad could no longer avoid mirrors and reflective surfaces. They seemed to seek him out, drawing his gaze even when he tried to look away. He would catch glimpses of his reflection, and each time, his eyes seemed darker, emptier, as though a piece of the abyss was slowly consuming him. One evening, as he washed his face in the small, cracked mirror above the sink, he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the reflection, behind his own image, stood a figure shrouded in shadow, its features obscured, but its eyes burning with a familiar, malevolent intelligence. It was the abyss, watching him, waiting for him to falter. A whisper filled the room, faint but unmistakable, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. You are mine, Conrad. We are bound. The shadow reached out, its hand brushing against his shoulder in the reflection, though he felt nothing on his skin. With a gasp, he stumbled back, turning to find the room empty. But the sensation of that touch lingered, a cold, invasive presence that seemed to seep into his very bones. Isolation and despair. Haunted by the visions, Conrad began to isolate himself, avoiding contact with others, retreating into his small room where he felt he could, at the very least, control his surroundings. The townspeople noticed his change, whispering as he passed, their faces filled with a mix of sympathy and fear. He spent his days and nights alone, tormented by whispers and glimpses of shadows that vanished the moment he looked at them directly. Sleep became a rare luxury, his dreams twisted by the abyss's insidious influence. He would wake in the middle of the night, feeling as though he were sinking, drowning in an invisible weight that pressed down on him, filling his lungs with cold, suffocating darkness. Father Elias visited him once, sensing his need for guidance, but Conrad found it difficult to explain the depth of his terror. How could he convey the feeling of being trapped between two worlds, the sensation that he was slipping, that he could no longer tell where the abyss ended and he began? The priest urged him to consider leaving Weinwick, to distance himself from the pool house and the memories that bound him to the abyss. But Conrad knew deep down that no matter how far he travelled, the shadow would follow. The abyss was not bound to a place, it was bound to him. The revelation of the final sacrifice. As his despair deepened, Conrad found himself returning to the library, seeking answers in old, forgotten texts. He pored over ancient books, obscure manuscripts, anything that might hold a clue, a way to break free from the darkness that had entwined itself with his soul. One night, as he read a dusty tome on spiritual rites, he found a passage that filled him with both dread and a faint glimmer of hope. It spoke of a ritual, a final severance that required not only the spirit, but the flesh, a willing surrender to the darkness, a symbolic death that could cleanse the soul of the abyss's mark. The passage described a journey into the place of shadows, a descent into the spirit world, where one would confront their deepest fears, their darkest memories. Only by facing the abyss within himself, by accepting it fully, could he hope to banish it forever. But the ritual came with a warning, a risk of losing oneself entirely, of being consumed by the very darkness he sought to purge. Descent into the abyss. With no other options left, Conrad prepared for the ritual. He gathered the items described in the text: a circle of salt, a shard of obsidian, and a candle made from the wax of an old church candle, melted and reformed for the rite. He waited until the dead of night, when the world was silent and the veil between worlds seemed thinnest. He sat within the circle, lighting the candle and placing the obsidian shard in front of him. The air grew heavy, the room filled with an unnatural stillness as he began to chant the words from the text, calling upon the spirit within himself, the part that had been touched by the abyss. At first, nothing happened, but then, slowly, he felt a pull, a sensation of sinking, as though the ground beneath him had given way, opening up into a dark, endless void. His surroundings faded, replaced by a thick, impenetrable mist that swirled around him, obscuring everything. And then, from within the mist, he saw it, the abyss, its form shifting and twisting, a shadowy figure that mirrored his own. It gazed at him with eyes that burned with a familiar hunger, a deep, unquenchable emptiness. "You have come to me willingly, Conrad," the abyss said, its voice a whisper that cut through the silence like a blade. "But there is no escape. You are bound to me, just as I am bound to you." Conrad took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage he possessed. "I came here to end this, to sever the bond that binds us." The abyss laughed, a hollow sound that echoed through the void. "You cannot end what is eternal. I am a part of you, Conrad. I am the darkness that lies within, the fear you cannot escape. You think you can banish me, but I am woven into the very fabric of your soul." Conrad felt a surge of despair, a wave of hopelessness that threatened to consume him. But he forced himself to stand tall, to face the darkness head-on. "I accept that you are a part of me," he said, his voice steady. "But you will not control me. I have seen your emptiness, felt your hunger, and I refuse to be bound by it." The abyss hissed, its form writhing, growing larger, more monstrous, as though feeding off his fear. But Conrad held his ground, clutching the shard of obsidian, its sharp edge a reminder of his resolve. With a final surge of strength, he pressed the shard against his palm, drawing blood, letting it fall onto the shadow's form. The abyss screamed, its shape dissolving, weakening as the blood merged with the darkness, symbolizing his acceptance, his willingness to confront and contain the fear. The mist began to dissipate, the shadow's form fading, retreating back into the depths from which it had come. Conrad felt a weight lift from his soul, a lightness that filled him with a sense of peace he had not known in years. As the darkness receded, he found himself back in his room, the candle's flame flickering, the obsidian shard clutched in his hand. The abyss was gone, its hold over him broken, and for the first time, he felt truly free. A new dawn. Conrad left the room, stepping out into the early morning light, feeling the warmth of the sun on his skin. The town of Weinwick lay quiet before him, the shadows no longer holding the same menace. The air filled with a sense of calm. He had faced the darkness within himself, confronted the abyss, and emerged whole. The mark was gone, the connection severed, and he knew that he would never again be haunted by the shadows that had once held him captive. As he walked through the town, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a strength that came from knowing he had overcome the darkness. The abyss might remain, lurking in the forgotten corners of the world, but it no longer held power over him. And as he looked out over the horizon, he felt a quiet peace, a sense of closure, knowing that he had reclaimed his life from the shadows and would carry the strength of that victory with him forever. Chapter 9. A New Darkness. Conrad left the pool house, feeling a quiet peace, believing he had finally severed the bond with the abyss. The emptiness that once weighed heavily in his chest was replaced by a strange lightness, as though he had walked free from a haunting shadow that had clung to him for too long. He thought he was finally safe, that he could reclaim the life he had once known before the abyss, before Jed, before Weinwick. Days turned to weeks as Conrad drifted between towns, seeking a place where he might rebuild himself, away from the memories and shadows of the past. But there was an emptiness he couldn't shake, a hollow ache that gnawed at him in the quiet hours. He would wake at night, haunted by strange, distant memories that seemed to slip through his fingers like sand, fading as soon as he tried to grasp them. It wasn't until a month later, when he settled into a remote town, that Conrad noticed the first sign, the feeling of eyes watching him from the darkness, from every shadowed corner. But when he turned to look, nothing was there. At first he dismissed it as a remnant of his experience, a ghost of his mind. But the feeling only grew stronger, more intense, each night, until he couldn't ignore it. The peace he had felt began to dissolve, replaced by a creeping sense of dread, an insidious fear that the abyss had left a mark on him that he hadn't understood, a shadow that lingered beyond his sight but pressed in on his mind. He was free, but the abyss, it seemed, was not finished with him. And a whisper from the past. One cold, quiet evening, Conrad found himself wandering through the town, unable to shake the growing tension that haunted him. The town was small, the streets silent, the fog curling around lampposts and darkened windows, casting everything in an ethereal light. It reminded him of Weinwick, of the fog-drenched streets and quiet, watchful eyes. He wrapped his coat tighter around him, but the chill seemed to seep into his very bones, an icy presence that had nothing to do with the weather. As he wandered, he passed an old bookstore, its display window filled with cracked, dusty volumes that looked as though they hadn't been touched in years. Something compelled him to enter, a pull that felt both familiar and strange, as though he were following a trail left by his own past. The shop was dark, dimly lit by a few flickering candles on the shelves. The scent of old paper and must filled the air, mingling with a faint metallic smell that sent a shiver down his spine. He walked slowly between the shelves, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, his eyes scanning the spines of the books. As he reached the back of the shop, he saw a figure standing by a dusty shelf, their back turned to him. It was a man, tall and thin, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed as he examined a book in his hands. There was something unsettlingly familiar about him, something that sent a chill down Conrad's spine. "Hello." Conrad's voice was hesitant, his hand tightening around the edge of a shelf as he took a step back. The figure didn't turn, but he raised his head, and Conrad felt a wave of recognition, a surge of memories flooding his mind. It was Jed, or rather, it was a shadow of Jed, a faint, ghostly image that flickered like a dying flame. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, his expression filled with a sorrow that seemed to reach out. filling the room with an overwhelming sense of loss. "You thought you were free, didn't you?" Jed's voice was soft, almost gentle, yet filled with a bitter edge. "You thought you could leave it behind." Conrad felt his heart pound in his chest, a sense of dread building within him. "Jed, I thought you were at peace. I thought I freed you." Jed turned slowly, his gaze meeting Conrad's, and the sorrow in his eyes seemed to deepen, a shadow flickering at their edges. "The abyss is never truly gone, Conrad. It's a part of you now, a shadow that will follow you no matter where you go." The words hung in the air, heavy with a truth that Conrad didn't want to accept. He had severed the bond, or so he'd thought. But now he wondered if he had only delayed the inevitable, if the abyss had merely allowed him to walk away, knowing he would return. Why are you here?" Conrad's voice was barely a whisper, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Jed's form flickered, his edges blurring, as though he were fading into the shadows that surrounded him. "I came to warn you. The abyss will always call to you, Conrad. You cannot escape it, because it lives within you. It knows your fears, your memories, your soul. You can run, you can hide, but it will always find you." Conrad felt a surge of fear, a sense of helplessness that threatened to consume him. He wanted to run, to flee from the darkness that lurked within him, but he knew that he couldn't escape himself, couldn't escape the shadows that had become a part of him. As Jed's form faded, his voice lingered in the air, a haunting whisper that echoed through the empty shop. "You will always carry the abyss with you, Conrad, and one day, it will come for you." And with that, Jed was gone, leaving only the silent darkness and the faint, lingering scent of the abyss. Unraveling memories. In the days that followed, Conrad found himself haunted by memories he couldn't shake. Faces, voices, moments from his past resurfaced in his mind, fragments of a life he had tried to leave behind. But these memories were twisted, distorted, filled with a darkness that wasn't there before. He would remember moments with his family, only to see their faces melt into shadows, their voices fading into whispers that echoed with the same haunting tone he had heard in the abyss. He would remember Jed, their laughter and adventures, but the image would shift, twisting into something dark and sinister, a reflection of the shadows that had consumed his friend. The memories felt like a curse, a reminder of the bond he had tried to sever, the part of himself he had given to the abyss. He began to wonder if he was losing himself, if the darkness was slowly consuming his soul, taking over his mind. As the days wore on, he found himself slipping further into the shadows, his sense of self unraveling as the memories twisted and shifted, blurring the line between reality and the abyss. He felt like a stranger in his own mind, haunted by a darkness he couldn't escape. At the calling of the abyss, one night, as he sat alone in his room, staring into the darkness, he felt a familiar pull, a deep, insistent call that seemed to come from within. It was the abyss, reaching out to him, calling him back to its depths. The pull was stronger than before, a force that tugged at his soul, filling him with a sense of inevitability. He knew that he couldn't resist it, couldn't fight the darkness that had become a part of him. He rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate, and made his way out of his room, down the darkened streets of the town. The fog was thick, swirling around him like tendrils of shadow, wrapping around his body as he walked. He didn't know where he was going, but he followed the pull, the call of the abyss, drawn to its darkness like a moth to a flame. The town was silent, the buildings looming like spectres in the mist, their windows dark and empty. As he walked, he felt a sense of peace settle over him, a calm acceptance of his fate. He was returning to the abyss, to the darkness that had claimed him, and he knew that he couldn't escape it. The fog grew thicker, obscuring his vision, and he found himself standing before an old, abandoned building. It was the pool house, or rather, a reflection of it, a shadowy version of the place where he had first encountered the abyss. He stepped inside, the darkness swallowing him, and made his way to the edge of the pool. The water was black, still and silent, its surface smooth and unbroken. He stared into its depths, feeling the pull of the abyss, the call that had haunted him since the day he had left Weinwick. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, letting himself sink into the water, into the darkness, into the abyss. Into the depths. The water was cold, an icy chill that seeped into his bones, filling him with a numbness that spread through his body. He sank deeper and deeper, the darkness closing in around him, enveloping him, consuming him. As he descended, he saw faces in the shadows, familiar figures that drifted past him like spectres. Jed was there, his face pale and expressionless, his eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed to echo through the depths. He saw his parents, their faces blurred and distorted, their eyes empty, their voices silent. He saw fragments of his life, memories that floated past him like wisps of smoke, fading into the darkness. The deeper he sank, the more he felt himself slipping away, his sense of self dissolving into the abyss, merging with the darkness that surrounded him. He was becoming a part of it, a shadow in the depths, a fragment of the abyss itself. He felt a strange peace, a quiet acceptance of his fate as he let go of his fears, his memories, his very soul. He was surrendering to the darkness, becoming one with the abyss, and he knew that he would never return. The abyss gazes back. As he reached the deepest part of the abyss, he felt a presence, a consciousness that surrounded him, filling him with a sense of awe and terror. It was the abyss, a force beyond comprehension, a darkness that stretched beyond time and space, a void that held the souls of the lost. It gazed at him, its eyes filled with a hunger, a cold, unyielding emptiness that seemed to reach into his very soul. He felt himself slipping away, his essence merging with the abyss, becoming a part of its endless void. And then, in that final moment, he understood. The abyss was not just a place, not just a curse. It was a mirror, a reflection of his own fears, his own darkness, a part of himself that he had tried to deny. It was a force that held the souls of those who had faced it, those who had become a part of its endless depths. He felt himself dissolving, his essence merging with the darkness, becoming one with the abyss. And as he slipped away, he felt a strange, haunting peace, a quiet acceptance of his fate. He was the abyss, and the abyss was him. Chapter 10. The Abyss Within and Beyond. Conrad had left the shadowed town of Weinwick, believing he had severed the abyss's hold over him. As he walked away from the pool house for the last time, the mist and fog closed behind him, sealing the town in his memory. He thought he could finally reclaim a life untouched by darkness, a life free from the sinister whispers of his past. But the more distance he put between himself and Weinwick, the more he felt that his journey was not yet over. Echoes of the abyss. At first, Conrad found himself sleeping more easily, his nights unbroken by the terror-filled dreams that had once haunted him. Yet, as weeks drifted by, strange occurrences began to creep back into his life. He would catch glimpses of his own shadow, but distorted, darker, as if it lingered a fraction of a second too long, a silent presence that followed him without cause. As time passed, the darkness grew thicker. He became painfully aware that his own mind had started to betray him. The shadows didn't just follow him. They began to slip into his thoughts, as though they could climb into his memories and settle there, rewriting the past with an unfamiliar chill. He saw brief images of his friends, his family, but something was off. The faces were twisted, their smiles faintly cruel, their eyes glinting with hidden malice. "Am I free?" he whispered to himself one night, the words echoing into the silence. But the silence wasn't empty. He could almost feel it listening, waiting, as if something lay beyond the quiet, lingering just out of reach. With every day, the thin layer of normalcy he had tried to cultivate began to peel away, revealing a darkness that seemed deeper and more pervasive than ever before. An unseen companion, unable to ignore the shadows pressing closer, Conrad found himself wandering through small, remote towns, seeking answers from strangers, from priests and healers, anyone who might know something about the abyss. He met with an elderly monk whose piercing gaze seemed to look straight through him, and who only offered one cryptic piece of advice. The abyss is a mirror, reflecting not the world, but yourself. To escape it, you must see it fully. Yet these words, though weighty, were of little help. No matter where he went or whom he sought out, he found no one who could understand the grip the abyss had on him. It was then that the whispering began. It started as a faint murmur, like distant wind chimes, so soft it could have been his imagination. But as the days wore on, it grew stronger, clearer, filling his mind with fragmented words, half-formed thoughts, and haunting memories. "Conrad!" The voice would whisper in the dead of night, a soft call that filled him with both dread and longing. It was familiar, achingly familiar, like a memory that tugged at his soul, but he could never quite place it. The voice would call to him, its tone filled with a twisted affection, almost a lover's whisper, and always the message was the same. "Come back, Conrad. Come back to where you belong." He fought against it, pushing the voice to the back of his mind, but it was relentless. It followed him everywhere, a constant presence that reminded him of what he had left behind, of the part of himself that had been lost in the abyss. A journey. Inward desperate to understand the voice, Conrad decided to return to the town of his birth, hoping to find something that would ground him, a remnant of his life untouched by the abyss. Perhaps, he thought, if he could remember who he was, he could reclaim his soul, his mind, his life. The journey back was long, filled with an uneasy silence that hung over him like a shroud. The countryside stretched out in endless waves of misty hills, each one cloaked in fog, as if the very land were holding its breath. Finally, he reached his childhood home, a small, worn cottage on the edge of a forest. The house was empty, abandoned for years. Its walls cracked and faded, but the memories it held were still strong, lingering in every room, every shadowed corner. He wandered through the house, letting his fingers brush over the dusty furniture, the faded photographs that lined the walls. But each memory was tinged with darkness, the faces in the photographs seeming to watch him with hollow eyes, as if they too had been claimed by the abyss. He made his way to the small attic where he had spent so many nights as a child, lost in books and dreams. The room was untouched, filled with relics of his past, old toys, notebooks filled with stories he had written, drawings of places he had dreamed of visiting. As he sat among these remnants, he felt a strange peace settle over him, a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. But then, as he looked around the room, he saw something he hadn't noticed before, a small mirror tucked away in the corner, its surface covered in dust. Without thinking, he reached for it, wiping away the dust to reveal his reflection. But the face that stared back at him was not his own. It was twisted, hollow-eyed, its expression filled with a mocking cruelty that sent a chill through him. "Hello, Conrad," the reflection whispered, its voice a low, taunting echo of his own. "Did you really think you could escape me?" Conrad recoiled, dropping the mirror, his heart pounding as the voice continued to echo in his mind. He realized then that he had never truly left the abyss. It had followed him, lingering in the depths of his mind, waiting for the moment when he would look into the mirror and see the darkness within. The abyss revealed. Unable to escape the torment, Conrad turned to the only person who might understand. He traveled to a distant monastery, seeking out a mystic named Father Roderick, a man known for his wisdom and his understanding of the unseen. Father Roderick listened patiently as Conrad poured out his story, recounting every detail of his encounter with the abyss, the shadows that haunted him, the voice that whispered in his mind. When Conrad finished, the priest sat in silence for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful, his expression filled with a quiet compassion. "The abyss is more than a place, Conrad," Father Roderick said finally, his voice soft but firm. "It is a reflection of your own soul, a mirror that shows you the darkness within. You cannot escape it because it is a part of you." Conrad felt a wave of despair wash over him. "Then what can I do? How do I sever this connection?" Father Roderick studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You cannot sever it, Conrad. You must confront it, face it fully, and accept it. Only by acknowledging the darkness within can you find the light that lies beyond." The priest's words filled him with a sense of both fear and hope. He knew that he could not continue to run from the shadows, that he had to face the darkness within himself, even if it meant returning to the abyss one final time. The descent into the abyss. That night, under the guidance of Father Roderick, Conrad prepared for a journey unlike any he had ever undertaken. He would descend into a deep meditation, a trance that would allow him to confront the abyss within his own mind, to enter the realm of shadows where the darkness waited. He sat in a circle of candles, their flames casting a soft golden light that flickered and danced, illuminating the darkness around him. He closed his eyes, focusing on his breathing, allowing himself to sink deeper and deeper into a state of calm, of silence. As he descended into the trance, he felt himself slipping away, his consciousness drifting from his body, sinking into a dark, endless void. He felt the familiar pull of the abyss, the cold, insistent tug that had haunted him for so long. He opened his eyes and found himself standing in a vast, empty space, a place of shadows and silence. The darkness stretched out before him, endless and impenetrable, a void that seemed to reach into eternity. And then, from within the darkness, he saw it, a figure, cloaked in shadow, its form shifting and twisting, a dark mirror of his own image. It was the abyss, the darkness within himself, the part of him he had tried to deny. The figure stepped forward, its hollow eyes fixed on him, its expression filled with a cold, mocking smile. "Welcome back, Conrad," it whispered, its voice a soft, sinister echo. "I knew you would return. You cannot escape me, because I am you." Conrad felt a surge of fear, but he forced himself to stand his ground, to meet the abyss's gaze with unwavering strength. "I am not afraid of you," he said, his voice steady. "You are a part of me, but you do not control me." The abyss's smile widened, its form shifting, dark tendrils of shadow reaching out to him. "You may deny me, but I am in every shadow, every fear, every doubt. I am the darkness within you, and I will never let you go." Conrad felt the tendrils wrap around him, cold and suffocating, pulling him into the darkness. But he closed his eyes, focusing on the light within himself, the strength that had carried him through every trial, every loss. He took a deep breath, allowing himself to feel the fear, the sorrow, the pain, accepting it all as a part of himself. And as he did, he felt the darkness begin to dissolve, the tendrils loosening, the shadows retreating. When he opened his eyes, the abyss was gone, its form dissipating into the void, leaving only silence. The light beyond the darkness. Conrad emerged from the trance, his body trembling, his mind filled with a profound sense of peace. He felt lighter, freer, as though a weight had been lifted from his soul. The darkness was still there, a part of him, but it no longer held power over him. He had faced it, accepted it, and in doing so, he had found the light that lay beyond. As he stood, Father Roderick placed a hand on his shoulder, his gaze filled with pride and compassion. "You have faced the darkness within, Conrad. You have found the strength to accept yourself fully, and in doing so, you have reclaimed your soul." Conrad nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. He felt whole, complete, as though he had finally found the peace he had been searching for. He left the monastery at dawn, stepping out into the light of a new day. The world bathed in a soft golden glow. The shadows still lingered, but they no longer haunted him. They were a part of him, a reminder of the journey he had undertaken, the battles he had fought, the strength he had found within himself. And as he walked into the morning light, he knew that he had finally found freedom, not from the abyss, but from the fear that had once held him captive. The road ahead was uncertain, but he walked it with a quiet confidence, a strength born of darkness and tempered by light. 4:0